Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, do any of you guys remember the PFS network? You know, that one YouTube channel that built a bit of traction last year by hiring crisis actors to appear on their channel and spread fear about finasteride? Well, as it turns out, I may have actually killed the channel because they haven't uploaded a video in 7 months now, which incidentally happens to be how long ago it was that I uploaded a video on the PFS network where I absolutely scientifically dismantled all their outlandish claims about some grand big pharma conspiracy theory to cover up the alleged hidden dangers of finasteride. Considering all content on their channel abruptly stopped after I uploaded my response video to them, I think it is safe to say that the PFS network is now starting to realize the hard way that YouTube is not a very safe space for them after all. I was hoping I had heard an end of this nefarious organization, but as it turns out, they're still begging for donations on their website and using that money to fund misleading studies that are deliberately manufactured using parameters designed to give outcomes favorable to their agenda, which is to get rich quick by suing Merck, as well as companies that market and sell finasteride like Hims and Keeps. Contrary to what the PFS network tries to imply, their agenda is not morally virtuous. The driving factor for them is greed. They wish to exploit the unjustified fear behind finasteride to generate revenue for donations that go right into their pocket and also use the money to fund bogus studies to help establish the foundation for a legal strategy that they are hoping will turn them all into millionaires. In order to do this, they need to convince their donors as well as a sympathetic jury of the existence of post-finasteride syndrome. Post-finasteride syndrome is of course not a real condition. It is an alt-right QAnon conspiracy theory that is popularly promoted on forums populated by incels, white nationalists, as well as flat earther and moon landing conspiracy theorists. It is not taken seriously by any credible scientific or medical community whatsoever. So in order to convince people of post-finasteride syndrome's existence, the PFS network and its associates are funding their own studies where they get to choose their own controls and even their own subjects who are recruited from the finasteride-hating cult known as the Propecia Help Forums. So obviously they are going to be able to design the study in a way that guarantees the outcomes that are desirable to their litigious, deceitful, and outright scamful agenda. As Dr. Richard Hoffman wrote in a post about post-finasteride syndrome in Health News Review, quote, "In highlighting the growing concerns about this condition, the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation cites ongoing studies at prominent institutions implying that this has become a priority research issue. However, these studies were actually funded by the foundation in part to help establish post-finasteride syndrome as a bona fide condition. An announcement describing one of these studies and providing patient recruitment details referred to those suffering from finasteride-related side effects as victims," unquote. He also wrote about the alerts sent out to physicians by the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation that, quote, "These appeals strike me as uncomfortably reminiscent of late-night TV and billboard pitches for malpractice attorneys," unquote. The latest example of this is yet another article trying to show that there are physical changes in people with supposed post-finasteride syndrome. This article comes from Dr. Irwin Goldstein, who has a sexual medicine practice in San Francisco, California. He has bona fide academic credentials, but he also buys into the post-finasteride syndrome fairy tale, since he specifically says that this is one of the problems he treats at his clinic. So he's really living the American dream here by taking people's money in order to treat a condition that doesn't even exist. So I don't know if he is supported by the post-finasteride syndrome network, but it's certainly in his financial interest to pretend that post-finasteride syndrome is real, so he can therefore attract patients who are convinced that finasteride has harmed their sexual health to his clinic, where I'm sure he makes a good profit separating fools from their money. So the article in question is drawn from patients seen in his clinic. It's actually not a full article, but rather it's just a published abstract. Abstracts are just short summaries of research that are presented at medical meetings. Abstracts are not peer-reviewed and don't contain a lot of details. So the abstract is titled, quote, "Vascular, neurologic, and hormonal abnormalities in men with persistent sexual dysfunction after discontinuation of finasteride," unquote. So what the authors of the study were trying to do here was duplicate the results of an earlier study that we went over in a previous video that showed some changes in the ultrasound of the penis in people complaining about post-finasteride syndrome. As is typical with research about post-finasteride syndrome though, that previous study lacked a control group and was funded by the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation and only had 25 subjects. So we're talking real bottom tier research here, the kind of trash you'd see in basement bargain level medical journals like Medical Hypotheses that talk about skull expansion. I'm talking real garbage here, chooms. So this new study reviewed charts of patients seen in Dr. Goldstein's San Diego Urology Clinic over a 5-year period and had selected charts of patients who had, quote, persistent sexual complaints, unquote. These patients claimed their symptoms started within 6 months of stopping finasteride and that their side effects from finasteride continued for at least 6 months. None of these men supposedly had any history of sexual problems before being on finasteride. Anyways, the investigators looked at the medical data that had been collected on these subjects, including their symptoms, the results of some standardized questionnaires on sexual function, hormone tests like DHT and testosterone levels, and ultrasounds on the penis. So, with this chart review, the investigators found 91 subjects, which was supposedly 9.6% of men evaluated during this period. Now, this may sound like a high percentage of patients, but remember, Dr. Goldstein advertises for post-finasteride syndrome patients, so I would bet there would be a lot fewer patients with supposed post-finasteride syndrome in a standard urology clinic that didn't say they specialize in treating post-finasteride syndrome. Anyways, the average age of the subjects was 39 years old, with most subjects between 32 and 46 years of age. The age is important because the incidence of erectile dysfunction increases with age, particularly over age 40, which is something I'll go into detail a little later on. So the researchers found that 95% of these subjects complained of erectile dysfunction, also known as ED. That seemed like a no-brainer since when most men talk about sexual dysfunction, they're usually talking about erectile dysfunction. So the results from the standardized questionnaires showed that erectile dysfunction was rated severe in 43%, mild to moderate in 23%, moderate in 12%, and mild in 10%. So not sure what the difference between mild to moderate and mild is. Maybe this is a typo and they meant moderate to severe, but who knows? Only 57 of the 91 subjects actually underwent penile ultrasound, though. In these ultrasounds, the investigators measured pressures in the right and left cavernosal arteries. Here are the pressures they found. I won't read these pressures off, but it turns out these pressures are actually normal or close to normal. Here's a table of normal penile pressures. So the two pressures measured, the peak systolic velocity and the end diastolic velocity, are actually normal, or at worst they're in the gray zone if you look at the average results. So the average pressures found in the study don't indicate severe vascular problems, even though the authors later conclude that the results indicate severe ED in these subjects. This kind of distortion is convenient for a profit-driven litigation business like the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Network, but it's not the kind of transparency you'd expect from an actual quality study. The authors also mentioned that 77% of the men who underwent penile ultrasound had, quote, abnormal erectile tissue inhomogeneity, unquote. Again, I'm not sure how the investigators defined this. I mean, it seems purely subjective to me. In this thorough review article by Jung that I used to get the table I just showed you, there is no mention of tissue inhomogeneity as a valid finding of penile ultrasound that can be used to diagnose the cause of erectile dysfunction. So this tissue inhomogeneity is just a soft finding since the study doesn't tell us if this finding has anything to do with the diagnosis of ED in these subjects. The abstract then states that orgasmic dysfunction occurred in 57% of the subjects, and genital anhedonia and anesthesia, meaning basically having a numb penis, occurred in 48% of the subjects. The investigators reported what's called QST testing, which means quantitative sensory testing, which supposedly shows how sensitive the penis is to touch, and this was abnormal in 60% of the men. Finally, there were some hormonal abnormalities in the men. 30% had a low DHT level, 16% had a low total testosterone level, and 9% had a low free testosterone level. Now, this is pretty odd because even the PFS Foundation has found no evidence that finasteride causes persistent changes in serum DHT and testosterone levels after finasteride is stopped. For example, a study by Basaria in 2016 showed no abnormalities of DHT and testosterone levels in any post-finasteride syndrome patient. patients. So some of these patients in the abstract probably had hormonal causes of ED, which cannot be blamed on finasteride because they were all off finasteride for at least 6 months, and the effects of finasteride on their hormone levels had already disappeared. ED was due to hormonal abnormalities in at least 30% of the subjects, though, and therefore couldn't possibly be related to finasteride. So the investigators conclude, quote, "While more research is needed, this population is young. ED is most often severe, and testing shows a high prevalence of vascular, neurologic, and hormonal pathologies," unquote. Okay, so to nobody's surprise, there are obviously a lot of problems with this article. First of all, it's just an abstract which is not peer-reviewed, so we can't tell if there are flaws in the methodology of the study or if the results were valid because no independent researcher has had access to the details of the study. Also, like all the post-finasteride syndrome studies published so far, there is no real control group here, so we don't know if the incidence of ED in these subjects was any higher than the incidence of ED in the general population. Remember, erectile dysfunction is an extremely common condition. 10% of men over 40 have severe or complete ED, and an additional 25% of men over 40 have moderate or intermittent ED, according to review articles on the subject. Even 5 to 10% of men aged less than 40 years old have ED. So contrary to popular belief, even in young men, erectile dysfunction is still fairly common. The average age in the study was 39 years old, so probably half of the men in the study were over 39 years of age. The bottom line, though, is that erectile dysfunction, ED, is extremely common, and it's estimated 30 million men in the US have it, which is why one of the most commonly prescribed medications in the world are Viagra and Cialis. Given how common ED is, it takes a lot more than just finding that some men with ED took finasteride in the past to prove that there is any causative link between finasteride and their ED. Plus, erectile dysfunction isn't just common, but it's also highly multifactorial. It can be psychogenic, it can be physical, or a combination of the two. Psychogenic ED is more common in younger men, but most men with ED have mixed ED with both psychogenic and physical causes. Overall, abnormal penile ultrasounds are very common in men with ED. In this study from 1999, out of 89 patients with ED, only 9% had a normal penile ultrasound. So 91% of these men with ED had abnormalities in their penile ultrasound. Also, remember this. Dr. Goldstein did not perform penile ultrasounds on all 91 subjects. He did it in just 57 subjects, so he may have only done the penile ultrasound on people with more severe symptoms who are more likely to have abnormalities on ultrasound. In any case, the bottom line here is that in a group of people with ED, it's not surprising in the slightest to see a lot of penile ultrasound abnormalities. This has nothing at all to do with whether ED is from finasteride. Also, like I already mentioned, the findings in the study of possible hormonal abnormalities as a cause of ED in some of these patients is not a feature of published studies on PFS type patients. So some of these patients in the abstract just had hormonal causes of ED not related to their taking of finasteride as a cause. So simply stated, their ED was from other factors, not finasteride. So the bottom line here is that the findings in this abstract are just what you'd expect to see from a bunch of subjects with an age around 40 years old with run-of-the-mill erectile dysfunction symptoms. So some people who get erectile dysfunction may have taken finasteride in the past, but this doesn't at all establish that there is a cause and effect. Erectile dysfunction is very common. It affects tens of millions of men in the United States alone, and since millions of men take finasteride, it would be surprising if there were no cases of ED in people who had previously taken finasteride. The fact is, though, is that there is absolutely nothing at all to distinguish these men in Dr. Goldstein's abstract from any of the millions of men with erectile dysfunction from other causes. So there is no reason to blame these cases on finasteride. You could probably find a lot of men with erectile dysfunction who had previously taken aspirin 6 months before, but no one would blame their ED on aspirin. This is a classic example of a logical fallacy. Correlation does not equal causation. This is something I learned way back in middle school, for Pete's sake. Yet here, we have someone who graduated from medical school making such an amateurish mistake. And this is not just my interpretation here, chooms. I found an article by Singh Singh from 2014 that is very skeptical of the PFS data and suggests that the only way to answer it properly is with a randomized prospective controlled study. Dr. Singh has some very good and very valid criticisms of the studies done so far on post-finasteride syndrome, and here are some of the quotes from his analysis. Quote, "A major concern is the level of selection bias among the participants. Many of the individuals were recruited from an internet website for individuals with persistent sexual side effects after using finasteride." Yes, that is what I've been saying this whole time. Thank you so much for bringing this up, doctor. Also, he says, quote, "Moreover, as referenced above, in the 2007 study by Mondani, a significant placebo effect was detected when patients were informed in advance about possible sexual dysfunction." Unquote. This is the nocebo effect I've been talking about, and I even made a video dedicated to that subject, which I'll link below. Here's another quote about the studies sponsored by the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation. Quote, "Moreover, these were retrospective studies with no placebo control. Given the retrospective nature of these studies, we cannot ascertain the true incidence of persistent sexual dysfunction and depression in finasteride users." Unquote. Finally, he concludes, quote, "Once again, given the data from the hundreds of randomized controlled trials, finasteride should still be considered a safe and well-tolerated medication. It is essential that further research is performed in the form of randomized controlled trials to further evaluate if there are any unique characteristics in these individuals suffering from prolonged sexual dysfunction and severe depression after using finasteride. These future double-blind placebo-controlled trials are necessary to conclude if these findings by Earwig are a red herring or potentially rare but serious side effect about which we should counsel our patients." Unquote. So you heard all that. Dr. Singh literally tells the PFS network exactly the kind of study they need to conduct in order to prove once and for all whether or not post-finasteride syndrome even exists. The PFS network and PFS Foundation have been funding and publishing studies since the early 2010s and possibly even earlier than that, and each and every time the studies published have the same flaws we saw in this study, which makes them so goddamn easy to debunk. So why is it that the PFS network doesn't bother to fund proper placebo-controlled double-blinded randomized studies that would make the outcomes of their research easier to believe? Well, sadly, these double-blind placebo-controlled studies were already done many years ago when finasteride was originally tested for treatment of benign prostatic hyperplasia as well as for treatment for androgenic alopecia. These studies found a low incidence of sexual side effects with finasteride and absolutely no evidence whatsoever of prolonged or persistent side effects. It's only been in the last decade or so that these excellent high-quality results have been questioned, and clearly the impetus has been litigiousness rather than science. But if the PFS Foundation was serious, what they would do is they would fund what would basically be a repeat of the original clinical trials of finasteride. Put people on finasteride or placebo for 2 years, then stop the drugs. Follow up the subjects over the next couple of years and look at the incidence of sexual dysfunction or depression in the two groups. If the study was truly blinded and if there was a difference in post-therapy side effects between the two groups, that would be evidence enough that post-finasteride syndrome was a real thing. But the PFS Foundation is not going to be doing that anytime soon or ever. Instead, they are funding little studies trying to look for biochemical or penile ultrasound changes in people who think they have post-finasteride syndrome. Why don't they just do good placebo-controlled randomized trials and answer the question once and for all as to whether post-finasteride syndrome even exists? Well, the answer to that is because even they are not confident that post-finasteride syndrome exists, but at the same time, they know the existence of their organization is contingent on people believing their lies and slander about finasteride. So as poorly designed as their research is, your average dumb shit isn't going to read anything beyond the title and abstract, and that is all it is going to take to convince your average nobody who has erectile dysfunction, who may have taken finasteride in the past, to be absolutely convinced that it was finasteride which destroyed their life, and they'll contribute money to whatever organization better helps them confirm their own biases. Not only that, but they'll viciously lash out and verbally abuse people online who dispute their self-diagnosis of post-finasteride syndrome. In fact, this was noted by the dermatologist Dr. Trueb, who in his case study on a patient with post-finasteride syndrome allegedly, he noted that the subject would display signs of hostility and aggression whenever it was just merely suggested that his symptoms may be from something other than finasteride. So it is clear here that the proponents of post-finasteride syndrome are not concerned by pesky little things like facts and evidence. They've already come to their conclusion, and they will bully and harass anyone who has had a positive experience with finasteride, because every time they hear about someone who took finasteride and had a good experience, it is a reminder of their own failures. The PFS Network is not a charitable organization. They are a profit-motivated cult who are driven by emotion and not logic, and more than anything, they just want people like me and other people who have benefited from finasteride to shut the hell up. However, their intimidation tactics are not going to work on me, because I know from firsthand experience that oftentimes the biggest obstacle towards fighting hair loss is just beginning the fight. And so long as the rampant fear-mongering about finasteride goes unchallenged, this will continue to be an obstacle for those who are new to the good fight against hair loss. Let me be perfectly clear though. I believe in freedom of speech. People should be allowed to say what they want, even if what they're saying is not grounded in reality. But with freedom of speech also comes a freedom to reply. So the PFS Network best believe that so long as they continue to spread their bullshit, I will be a vanguard against the terror they spread about safe drugs like finasteride that have saved the lives and confidence of millions of men. So in case anyone from the PFS Network is watching this, all I have to say is, better luck next time, assholes. I'll be waiting for you the next time you fleece enough desperate and ignorant people to fund your latest garbage study. Bye-bye now.